California who wanted to know, what does it take in order for a young person to give up something they believe in? Now, they didn't want to mess with their religion because they were afraid that that would have lifelong consequences. So they decided to conduct an experiment to try to get these young people to give up their toothbrush. They divided the groups out into 6 individual separate classes of 100 people. So here's the way they did it. They paid an actor. Paid the guy to come in. They gave him a white starch lab coat, a doctor's coat, a lot of initials after his name. And this guy was told, do what you have to do to get them to give up their toothbrush. He had the PowerPoint slides. He had the graphs, the charts. The very first group that came in, they got nothing. They literally gathered together. They sent them into the room. They said, we want you to go listen to this guy. And this guy was good. For an hour, he went on about how toothpaste caused cancer and that the bristles would actually leave pits that would leave places for bacteria to grow. And I kid you not, by the end of the hour, he had this whole room thinking basically the worst thing you could do is to brush your teeth. And most of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 2, right before they sent them in, they actually gathered them together. They said, now, you know you've been told since you were little that you need to brush your teeth. Now, we want you to go listen to this guy. And again, he went on for an hour and he shared with them all of the horrible tragedies about brushing your teeth. And again, most of them gave up their toothbrush. Group number 3, they got that reminder. But they were also warned. They were told, we're about to send you into a place where they're going to try to get you to give up your toothbrush. And they sent them in. And again, he goes on about how toothpaste causes cancer and how the bristles will leave pits that bacteria can grow in. And sure enough, a lot of those folks gave up their toothbrush. Group number 4, they got all that. They got the reminder. They got the warning. But notice this, they also got the guy's arguments. They told him, they said, hey, you're going to go in here and this guy's probably going to try to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer. They sent them in. Group number 5 got all of that. They got the reminder, they got the warning, they got the guy's arguments, but they also got answers to his arguments. They said, this guy's going to try to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer, but he's not going to tell you that you got to eat 78 gallons a day in order for it to cause cancer. He's going to try to tell you that the bristles of a toothbrush will leave pits that bacteria can grow in, but he's not going to tell you that enamel is one of the toughest substances in the world. They sent them in. The very last group, group number 6, they received the reminder. They got the warning, they got the guy's arguments, they got answers to his arguments. But right before they sent them in, they gathered them up, they said, now look, this guy may throw some stuff at you that we haven't discussed. He may throw some charts on there that we haven't covered, but that doesn't change the very real fact that brushing your teeth is good for you. We want you to go in and listen to this guy, but we want you to use logic and reasoning. They sent them in. Now, if I ask you which group you think did the best, obviously it's group number 6, right? Why? Because group number 6 was inoculated. They were prepared. And yet, if I ask you which group did the worst, most of you probably think group 1, right? Believe it or not, it was actually group number 2. The one that just got the reminder. And you say, okay, Brad, what's your point? Folks, listen to me. My point is, if an actor can get your child to give up a toothbrush in 1 hour, think about what a professor can do in a semester to their faith. And here's the scary part. The group that did the worst, group number 2, they're the ones that just got that reminder. It sounds an awful lot to me like a person who would say, now, we've told you from the time you were little that God is real, now go get your degree. And we've got a lot of our young people who are giving up their spiritual toothbrush. What I want us to do this morning is kind of pick up where we left off last night. For those of you who were here last night, you remember I told you that according to the Bible, things were relatively young. And in fact, we looked at the genealogies talking about the fact that things were young, and yet almost every young person in this room is familiar with statements like these, talking about a Big Bang that happened billions of years ago. In fact, the bottom of this page, it says, in a closed universe, a Big Bang may occur once every 80 to 100 billion years. I had a youth minister ask me this question one time. Could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Before I answer that question, I want us to spend just a moment or two talking about the science side of the Big Bang. Because in all reality, it's miserable science. I mean, think about it for just a moment. Do the textbooks actually tell you where the stuff came from? No, they start literally mid-bang. Where did all the matter for the universe really come from? Let me share with you a conversation that I had with an atheist. He and I were sitting in a coffee shop, and I was trying to get my hands around his belief system. And I told him, I said, help me understand where you're coming from. So what was the beginning? He told me, he said, Brad, I want you to clear your mind of everything. I said, okay. He said, that's what was here. He said, there was literally nothing. I looked at him, I said, okay, then help me understand what exploded. I kid you not, this guy looks me square in the eyes and he says, well, the nothing exploded. I looked at him, I said, okay, you're expecting me to believe there was nothing. And one day, for whatever reason, the nothing went boom, and we got all of this. He said, uh-huh. I told the guy, I said, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because that takes more faith than believing in a God. Folks, when you think about it, what they're doing is they're telling our kids that in 3.4 seconds, everything radiated out into space, and boom, now we've got this ordered universe. Okay, my middle son, when he was just 8 years old, he realized there's a problem with this. We were driving around, he said, Dad, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? I said, what's kind of dumb? He said, to think that you can get an ordered universe from an explosion. And I thought, my kids get it. I said, Reese, you're absolutely right. I said, can you imagine if we took a stick of dynamite and we put that in your bedroom and we blew it up? He laughed from the back seat. He said, probably wouldn't look any different, would it, Dad? Now, folks, while he didn't understand the first and the second law of thermodynamics, science is violating both of them. Let me explain that for you. Number one, we're creating matter from nothing. And number two, we're going from a chaotic explosion to an ordered universe. How do they explain that? How do they explain the very start of their theory gets going by violating all these scientific principles? I'm going to let a guy named Paul Davies tell you his explanation. This is an evolutionist who said, the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. He says it represents a true miracle. My question is, why is that more scientific than saying in the beginning, God did? You see, when you really actually look at the evidence, folks, we know deep down, almost every scientist out there recognizes the Big Bang didn't happen. The problem is they don't have another godless theory to plug into it. And so until they've got another godless theory, we're going to keep beating the Big Bang drum. Let me share with you why we know it didn't happen. Right now, we know Jupiter is twice as hot as it's the heat that it's receiving from the sun. And by that I mean this. It's giving off twice as much heat as it is receiving from the sun. But folks, that Big Bang allegedly happened 18 to 20 billion years ago. Don't you think it would have cooled off by now? Yeah. All you guys in this room, think about this. Your wife, she's making homemade cookies. She puts them on the counter. You go to get one. She said, no, 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 no. They've got to cool first. So you wait 18 to 20 billion years, right? No, you wait about 30 seconds and you burn your mouth. Here's the point. It should have long cooled off by now. You look in the universe, if this really was a central explosion, matter should be evenly distributed, right? It's not. So, in looking at this and realizing we've got volcanic eruptions on some of the moons of Jupiter, knowing, for instance, we've got Ganymede that's got a molten liquid core, we got plenty of scientific data that proves this thing is wrong. In fact, let me share with you something most of you will never see. This is a comment from an astronomer written to his fellow astronomers. It's a guy by the name of Bob Berman. He wrote an article where he suggested that a warning be placed before every science article talking about the Big Bang. Take a look at what his warning says. Warning, the following contains contemporary cosmology. Reading it can produce disorientation and confusion. Nobody knows what's going on, and nothing you read here is likely to be true. Now, that's one astronomer written to his fellow astronomers. How do they present it to our kids? Pretty much as fact, right? Let's get back to that question. Could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Folks, all we really need are the first two verses of the Bible. If you've got your Bibles this morning, go ahead and open them up to Genesis chapter 1. Take a look at verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the surface of the waters. How does Moses describe the earth on that very first day? Well, ask yourself this question. What was the Spirit of God moving over? Waters, right? Have you really thought about the fact that on day one this was a water-covered heavenly body? I mean, literally, land had not been brought forth yet. This was a water-covered heavenly body. Now, scientifically speaking, do we know the boiling temp of water? Depending on which system you use, it's either 100 degrees or 212, right? Folks, that Big Bang allegedly took place at a temperature you and I can't fathom. It's in the millions of degrees. So how do you go from a million-degree explosion to having a water-covered heavenly body on the same day? Fact is, you can't. You add to that the fact that the sun, the moon, the stars, what day did they actually come into the picture? That was day 4. Folks, look at that for just a moment. Is there any way that we can squeeze the Big Bang into God's creation account? Not without compromising God's Word. Now, let's stop right here for just a moment. Everybody, I want you to put your thinking caps on this morning. If evolution is true, somebody tell me, where did the water come from? I mean, 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by water, right? Everybody in this room learned the water cycle when you were in junior high or high school, right? In order to have a water cycle, though, you have to have what? You got to have water. Because you got evaporation up, clouds move over, rain comes down, and it's a cycle. But in order to have that cycle, you first got to have what? Water. About 3 weeks ago, evolutionists finally figured out where we got the water from. They decided that it came from asteroids that delivered it here. Now, I didn't know we had bottled water delivery way back then, but apparently so. Interesting, we have never in the history of science seen that happen. And they won't touch the fact that when something comes into our atmosphere, what does it do? It burns up. But here's the thing. They realized they cannot ever explain how the water got here. So instead of actually thinking logically and thinking, you know what, maybe our theory doesn't fit, they decided asteroids brought the water enough, by the way, to fill up the oceans, even though it doesn't make any sense. Could we rely on the Big Bang? Not at all. And somebody says, no, wait a second, Brad, maybe what you're doing is you're thinking too narrowly. Maybe you're limiting God. Okay, now I will say this, I am going to limit him to what he said he did, okay? But if you're sitting here and you're thinking, maybe each one of those days was like 1,000,000 years. Again, let me encourage you, get your Bible, open it up to Genesis 1. Let's take a look together at verse 5, verse 8, verse 13, verse 19, where Moses records over and over the same phrase. He says, so evening and morning were the first day. So evening and morning were the second day. Notice what he's doing. He's putting a punctuation at the end of God's creative activities. Calls it an evening and a morning. And then he gives it a numerical adjective. Day 1, day 2, day 3. And folks, think about this for just a moment. If each one of these was not a 24-hour day, somebody explain to me what he's talking about in verse 14, where he said, God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. Folks, in that one verse, you get 3 categories of time. Days, years, and seasons. If each one of these was not really a 24-hour day, what's he talking about? Now, you look at verses like Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, where it says, for in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Keep your mind on Exodus 20:11 and then flip over to Exodus 31, where he tells us what the punishment is for working on the 7th day. It's death. And in fact, in Exodus 31, starting about verse 15, it tells us why. And he goes on to say, because the Lord created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, he rested and was refreshed on the 7th. Now, does anybody in this room honestly think the Israelites were standing around going, I really think we ought to work for 6 eons of time and rest 1 eon? Or do you think they knew, I'm going to work 6 days and be off on the 7th, just like God did? In fact, anybody in this room that honestly is not sure how long these days were, I got an answer for you. It's going to keep it very simple and keep it very straight. If I asked you, when were all the flowering plants created? We got some grandparents and children that know the answer because they know that little song, day 1. It's day 3, right? Day 3, God created all the green flowering plants. Now, if I ask you, what do they need in order to reproduce? Everybody here recognizes you got to have sunlight, you got to have water. But you also have to have things like the right atmosphere, you got to have the right nutrients in the soil. But you also have to be pollinated, don't you? Folks, listen to me for just a moment. Those little flying insects that drive you crazy, they serve a bigger purpose in God's greater plan. They pollinate the plants. In fact, any of you in this room that have ever done orchards, or you know that there's cross-pollination. You got to have it, or else they won't produce seeds. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. Let's assume each day is 1,000,000 years. I would point out that doesn't buy you enough time. You need billions, but we'll assume each day is 1,000,000 years. So you're telling me God put all the flowering plants here on day 3, and we had to wait 2,000,000 years before the flying creatures were created? Because you remember, all flying creatures and water creatures were created when? Day 5. You telling me that all the plants were here for 2,000,000 years before they could be pollinated? That's illogical. Now, it's a whole lot easier just to simply say, God did it the way he said he did it. You say, okay, but Brad, I hear what you're saying, but if you do that, then that doesn't leave enough time for what? For evolution. See, folks, they have infected our minds so much that we believe you've got to have evolution to get us there. When the reality is, evolution and creation, totally opposite. You look at the Bible, it says we got water first and then land. That's not what evolution is teaching your kids. Evolution is saying we had this explosion. You had these these rocks that flying out into space. You got land first, and then somehow later on we got water. And so what do? They keep trying to tell our kids that we all came from some common ancestor millions of years ago. This is an issue of Discovery that says, was your ancestor a sea sponge on the inside? They would say, this is your ancestor. Now that may be their ancestor, it's not mine. Okay? But again, all of us have kind of been infected. The reason I say that, think about this. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you in here remember studying the geologic column in school? Pretty much everybody, right? You know about the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period, the Carboniferous period. That geologic column by itself builds in millions of evolutionary years. I asked a young man one time, I said, when you were learning that, when you were memorizing the ages, did they also teach you where it came from? He looked at me funny and said, no, they didn't tell us that. I said, I didn't think so. I said, because that particular column was built in the 1800s, and it was based almost solely on assumption. You see, in the 1800s, we had no idea how long it took for striatal layers to be laid down. We didn't know anything about canyon formation, and so what they did was they built a column that supported the evolutionary time frame. And yet, folks, listen to me, 32 years ago, that column was totally dismantled. The eruption of Mount St. Helens, 32 years ago. For those of you sitting out there going, was it really 32 years? Yeah, it was. You're that old. 32 years ago, that thing erupted. And when it did, we learned more about geology in about 3 months than we have learned basically in the time of man. Because, folks, this is the most studied volcano of all time. My son and I, we were actually there on the 30th anniversary. And I want to share with you very quickly this morning 5 things that we learned from Mount St. Helens. I'm going to use the acronym SUPER. S-U-P-E-R. 5 things that are not going to be in your kids' textbooks. They're not going to be on CNN. The 5 things that are factual for Mount St. Helens. We'll start with those striatal layers. If you look on the screen, you'll notice each and every one of the layers that they're trying to tell our kids, but you'll also notice the time that they say each one of these areas represents. So for instance, we go all the way back to the Cambrian period. We're roughly 500 million years old. And then we jump up here to the the Devonian period, 300 million years, Carboniferous, 250, Triassic, about 200 million years old. And so what they say is that each one of these layers represents a long period of time. Now, if you look on the screen, that rock bluff is about 120 feet tall. The reason I know that is my son and I, we stood right here as we were filming a portion of a documentary. If you look carefully, this rock on top, they would say that that is sedimentary rock. Evolutionists claim it's over 100 million years old. The only problem with that is everything you're looking at was laid down in a matter of just a few weeks 32 years ago. In fact, we've got video evidence showing us, for instance, everything below this yellow line was put down in the initial eruption, May the 18th, 1980. Everything between the 2 yellow lines was put down in a secondary eruption, June the 20th, 1980. You see the little layers in there? Everything above that top yellow line was put down March the 19th, 1982. Folks, here's my point. Everything you're looking at on the screen was put down in just 2 years. Not 200,000, not 2 million. And in fact, anybody in this room that was born before May the 18th, 1980, you're old as a rock. Think about that for just a moment. Everything on that screen is younger than that. So when they try to tell us, hey, you know, it takes long periods of time for these layers to be put down, we've got a living laboratory that says, no, that's not the case. So the S is for rapid striatal layering. The U is for upright logs. If you were to go to Mount St. Helens today, there's a lake on the north sector called Spirit Lake. And when the volcano erupted, it took basically all of the logs from the surrounding ridges and just flushed them into this lake. It was like a massive explosion. They estimate there to be over 1 million trees in that lake today. Most of them were floating in a log mat. A buddy of mine by the name of Dr. Steve Austin has done extensive work on Spirit Lake and the whole surrounding area. You'll see him there at the bottom of the screen in scuba gear, one of his colleagues with him. He's actually recording what is happening. And he told me, he said, Brad, what we're seeing is these logs will float in this log mat for quite literally decades before they become completely water saturated, and then they'll sink down, the heavy Rudian sinks down, and they bob on the surface for years, straight up and down, before they finally settle into the bottom of the lake standing straight up. He showed me video footage. Literally, it looks like a forest down there. So this is what we're seeing in Spirit Lake caused by a catastrophe. And yet, folks, that's what we see in the fossil record as well. Take a look at the screen very carefully. At the bottom here, you'll notice these are 3 men standing at the bottom of a massive bluff. Those are 5 fossilized trees. But I want you to notice they're going through several different layers, aren't they? How do you have a tree that starts growing in the Carboniferous period and it grows up through the Triassic period? Folks, if you're a dead tree, you're going to stick around for 200 million years? Or are you going to decay and rot? Interestingly, we've got these fossils literally all over the place. My family and I, we were in Nova Scotia about 3 months ago. There's a place called the Fundy Bay where water goes in and out of this bay quicker than anywhere else on the planet. And they've got fossils going through several different layers. And folks, here's my question. How in the world can you have fossilized trees that are going through multiple layers if this thing took millions and millions of years? Or maybe we ought to admit it doesn't take that long, and maybe we ought to admit the fact that a catastrophe explains these a whole lot better, doesn't it? Maybe like a global flood or something. So the U is for the upright logs that we find there. The P is for peat formation. This is an aerial shot that we took from a helicopter. That's Spirit Lake. You'll notice that the massive log mat is still there. I believe there's still over 38,000 trees still floating from the initial eruption. Here's the interesting thing though, if you were to go there today, there's not a stitch of bark on any of those trees because it's all in the bottom of the lake. Those trees have been bumping together for 30 years now. Literally all of the bark is in the bottom. My buddy Steve Austin, he told me, he said, Brad, we found peat beds several feet thick. Now you look at me and you say, who cares? What's peat? Folks, peat is a precursor to making coal. They are making coal in the bottom of Spirit Lake during the lifetime of men. And yet, we've always been told coal takes 250 million years. And yet, we got a living laboratory now that's telling us, no, it doesn't take that long. The E is for eroding canyons. Now, if I didn't tell you anything at all about the picture behind me, other than maybe these canyons are about 600 feet deep, you might assume that the little river you see right there, that river carved out the canyon, right? And that's what they always tell us. And yet, the canyons you're looking at were formed in 2 days. And here's how we know that. If you look at carefully on the screen, you'll notice Mount St. Helens did not just erupt straight up. It also came out a little bit. The mountain itself was growing. The girth of the mountain was growing at 15 to 35 feet per day. The the week before that it exploded. I mean, it was literally just doing this. I tell young people, it kind of like a big zip, just waiting to blow. Right before it did, all of the snow and the ice right here in this sector came down into this valley. The volcano erupted, lava comes dumping out. What do you think happens to snow and ice when it comes in contact? By the way, this picture was taken on the day, the 30th anniversary. So to kind of give you an idea of how much snow and ice was still present, picture in your mind this thing going on up into the cone. All of that snow and ice comes down into the valley. Lava comes dumping out. What happens to snow and ice when it hits lava? It immediately converted to steam. And folks, steam's got to go somewhere. And it blew canyon vents 600 feet deep in 2 days. You see, we know that today. We've got physical evidence that you can blow a canyon. In fact, all across the United States of America, we've now figured out it doesn't take that long to make canyons. We've got the Little Grand Canyon. Basically, it was a dam that broke. Water comes pouring out of it. What happened? It cut a canyon. We now call it the Little Grand Canyon in a matter of just a couple of days. And yet, what are we told? Over millions of years, the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon from solid rock. I want to see a show of hands. How many of you remember sitting in class being told that that river carved the canyon? Anybody in here? Pretty much everybody, right? Okay, well, let's see what we know for sure. We know for sure the Grand Canyon exists, right? There's two different interpretations. You've got evolutionists who would say, hey, it was formed slowly by a little bit of water over a lot of time. Then you've got creationists that say, wait, time out, hold on. We have a living laboratory at Mount St. Helens that shows us you can do this thing fast with a lot of water over a little amount of time. The problem is in the textbooks today, evolutionists are erasing the line between what is fact and what is their interpretation. And so our kids are reading sentences like this. The Colorado River is cut through layer upon layer of rock over millions of years. If you don't remember anything else from this lesson, I want you to remember this. That river didn't carve the canyon. And here's how I know that for sure. Take a look at the screen. River enters the canyon at an elevation of 2,800 feet. Scientific fact that nobody can refute. If you want to check me, take a GPS and set it there. 2,800 feet. The south rim that everybody looks at and you see the handiwork of God, folks, it is sitting at an elevation of 6,900 feet. You know what that means that river would have had to have done? It would have had to flow uphill 4,000 feet, folks, in elevation. Now, I'm not a hydrologist, but I do know that water sinks the lowest level, doesn't it? Water doesn't flow uphill. And yet they're going to tell us that river carved the canyon, even though they already know the elevations. They're not going to tell you the truth because, folks, the truth does not fit their theory. Here's the bottom line. We keep getting evidence in that disproves the evolutionary theory, and instead of throwing the theory out, that's what they're doing. They're throwing the evidence out. The last one, the R, is for rapid recovery. This is a shot that we took about 3 minutes into the blast zone on our very first day. And as you can tell, stuff is back in it. Now, when Mount St. Helens first erupted, they told us it's going to be about 120,000 years before stuff came back. And for those of you who really do remember this occasion, it really was like an atomic bomb had gone off. Everything was gray. There was ash all over the place. It killed all the life. I mean, just like that. So it was literally a blank slate. They looked at it and said, it's going to take 120,000 years before anything will come back. Then they came back and adjusted their numbers to 60,000. Not sure who made the adding mistake. Well, that's 30 years later. And stuff is back. In fact, the elk were some of the first to come back. Elk have very, very tough hooves. And what they discovered is those elk were walking across the pyroclastic flows, the lava flows that had hardened. and their hooves would break into the lava, and then the elk do what elk do. They fertilize. And all of a sudden, plants started coming back. And more animals started coming back. Now, I want you, each one of you, to ask yourself this simple question. It's a very basic question. If evolution is true, and you have a blank slate at Mount St. Helens, why didn't we evolve new plants and animals? I mean, if it's a blank slate, wouldn't it make sense that we get new creatures? In fact, wouldn't it make sense that we get creatures that were like volcano-proof? You know, mice with Kevlar umbrellas or something? And yet everything that came back, we've already recorded. Why? Because evolution, folks, is a fairy tale. And yet, here's the sad thing. Everything that I'm showing you, it's not opinion, it's not hypothesis. It's all fact that we've learned. And yet your kids aren't going to see it in their textbooks. Why? Well, if you ask yourself this, what is one thing that they got to have lots and lots of? They got to have lots and lots of time. In fact, let me show you a page out of a teacher's edition. This is a textbook that most of you will never see. Check out what I highlighted. Stress that the earth is thought to be at least 4.5 billion years old. Folks, why would we stress that? Because without that old age, you're not going to get off the ground. Somebody says, okay, I hear what you're saying, Brad, but do we have any more evidence that things aren't as old as they seem? How about this one, magnets? Most of you have probably got magnets on your refrigerator. A couple of things we know about magnets. Number one, we know that they lose their strength over time. Number two, we know the earth has a magnetic field around it. You don't believe me? Ask a Boy Scout to hold a compass. You know what it points to? Not just north, magnetic north. The third thing we know for sure, scientifically speaking, is the earth has lost 6% of its magnetism in the last 150 years. Scientific fact. And folks, look at that. We lost 6% of our magnetism in 150 years. You know what that tells me? That tells me there's no way that this earth is billions of years old or we have no magnetism left. Second, it tells me that carbon dating, a process that is dependent on uniformity, is no good. Now, as you're thinking about that, consider for a moment the Sahara Desert. What does it tell us about the age of the earth? Right now we know the Sahara Desert is growing roughly a foot every single year. It's a process called desertification. In fact, if you look on the screen behind me, the yellow area is where the desert started out. The beach area is where it is today. The hatched area at the bottom is the direction it's growing. So we ask the question, okay, if we extrapolate backwards and we ask ourselves, how old is the Sahara Desert? The answer is about 4,000 years old. You say, wait a second, Brian, you said last night that things were closer to 6. Yeah, but what happened about 4 to put all of our weather patterns in place? How about a global flood? Would that do it? Let me go to this particular page out of the textbook. I show you this for 2 reasons. Number one, it goes back to what we were discussing during the question and answer session last night about the problem we've got with teaching. And number two, it's great evidence for a young earth. Remember, we were talking last night about the fact that we live in the No Child Left Behind era, and kids are memorizing factoids. Take a look at this. It says, for example, the Mississippi River deposits sediment at a rate of 80,000 tons an hour. So you know what our kid memorizes? Mississippi River, 80,000 tons an hour. He can ready to take a test. Okay, but folks, let's set that aside and let's actually use our brains for a second. 80,000 tons of sediment is coming down the Mississippi River every hour, which, by the way, it is. If that's true, how much further should this stretch out if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old? Well, you do the math, and folks, guess what? There would be no Gulf of Mexico. It should have already filled in by now. Now, while we're talking about water, how about this? We know today the oceans are 3.6% salt water. We know precisely how the salt gets there. We know how fast it's happening because of the water cycle we just discussed, right? Water goes up into the air, clouds come over land, rains down, picks up salt minerals, deposits them back in the ocean. We're sitting at 3.6 in the ocean out there, or out there. Not sure which way I need to point. Here's the point. We could have gone from fresh water to salt water in less than 5,000 years. You know what that tells you? Everything we're hearing about millions and billions is a fairy tale. I had a really odd experience last week. I was in London, and I spent several hours at the London Museum of Natural History. Total evolutionary propaganda garbage. It was sad. And the reason I say that is because basically at that particular museum, everything was millions and billions. I then go over to the London Museum of History, where they actually have artifacts. It's pretty cool if you ever get a chance. It's got the Rosetta Stone, they've got the Gilgamesh tablet, all these different actual artifacts. I go from millions and billions to a museum that actually has artifacts, real thing, real McCoy, and nothing in there is over what they would say 8,000 years old. So I'm sitting here scratching my head going, okay, we've got artifacts, real things that you can touch that go back, they would say 8,000 years, and then there's this gap in time to several millions. Where's all the stuff in between? You ever noticed? It's either things are several thousand years or millions of years. You don't hear things being 500,000 years. We don't have anything in history for that. Why? Because again, evolution requires the time. Let me give you a couple more real quick before we take a break. Oil. Now, I recognize Georgia's not a big oil country. Neither is Tennessee. But I am going to share with you one thing that I've learned from the plains of West Texas, and that is never, ever, ever place your finger over an oil cap. The reason being, some of that oil is held underground with pressure as high as 20,000 pounds per square inch. 20,000 psi. Now, to give you an idea how much pressure that is, your tires are inflated right now probably to about 35 psi. This is 20,000. If it blows, it would literally rip your finger off of your hand. But folks, again, in using logic and thinking about it, we got to ask the question, how long can rock hold pressure that is pushing up like that at 20,000 pounds per square inch? The answer, according to science, is less than 10,000 years. All right, where did the oil come from? Take a look at this. It says the other two major fossil fuels are petroleum and natural gas. The formation of these two fuels is not yet fully understood. Both are thought to form from the decay of organisms that once settled in the sea. The remains of these organisms settled on the sea floor were gradually covered by sediment. After millions of years, the remains were slowly changed by heat and pressure. So they're saying all this stuff was covered up in the sea, and it was changed by heat and pressure. I would ask you, do we have anything historically speaking that would explain why all the stuff that used to be living got covered over and converted to fossil fuels? Like, would that do it? Yeah, it would. We look at Niagara Falls. Another example that things aren't as old as they tell us. Water going over the leading edge of the falls is wearing it back. It's actually eroding it back at a constant rate. If you look on the screen behind me, you'll notice they've actually measured where the leading edge of the falls were at particular years, wearing back in roughly 4.7 feet a year. So we ask the simple question. If the Earth is billions of years old, how deep should the Niagara Gorge be? The answer, it should have lapped the globe twice by now. And yet when you actually do the calculations, notice this. Simple calculation shows that it's been about 9,900 years since the Niagara River started cutting its gorge back. That's a whole lot closer to my numbers, isn't it? Somebody says, Brad, I hear what you're saying. And I appreciate you, brother, but there's no way things can be that young, because last year we went exploring into a cave, and we were there, and this park ranger told us, don't touch the stalactites because it takes them millions of years to form, and the oil from your finger will stop the growth. Anybody ever heard something like that? Oh yeah. That's what we hear, right? Tiny drops of water over millions of years created. That's interesting to me because on the screen, that's actually stalactites hanging from the Lincoln Memorial that was built in 1922. Or maybe somebody could explain all of these stalactites, some of which are hanging from the switch sign that was installed by men in the sled mine. Or how about this one? Surely I don't have to tell anybody in this room, we haven't had indoor plumbing for millions of years. Ever. This is actually my favorite right here. This is a place called Mother Shipton's Cave over in Yorkshire. If you ever get a chance to go, let me encourage you. It is a place where you can go and you can tie a teddy bear or a hat or a favorite trinket, come back in 3 days, and it is completely covered over. We actually got to hold one about 3 weeks ago. We were over in Scotland, and a buddy of mine, John Galloway, he has a teddy bear that was there, and he passed it around to us. We were looking at everything, and it's like solid rock. In fact, he told my kids, he's like, please don't drop it. Why? Because it looks like a stalactite. 3 days. Or what about this one? A bat encased in a stalagmite. Now ask yourself this question. Did that little bat sit there while tiny drops of water hit him over millions of years? Or have we been sold a bad bill of goods? You see, we've got evidence that is totally disproving what they're telling us. And yet, because it doesn't fit the evolutionary theory, they won't broadcast it. I'm going to give you one more, and then we're going to take about a 10-minute break. The last one is an example from Wyoming. It's a place called TP Fountain. TP Fountain was actually started, you'll notice this, in the year 1903. It is a mineral fountain bubbling up. A guy took a lead pipe and he jammed it into this fountain, forcing the water to come up over the pipe and down the side. Well, it began to leave deposits all over the sides of this lead pipe, kind of like the deposits you would see in your sink. Except this is a mineral fountain. It had all kinds of deposits. And it kept growing and getting bigger, and they kept having to add more pipe. My family and I, we were there last year, and remember, this thing started off at ground level in 1903. That's what it looks like today. It doesn't take millions of years, folks. Now, those of you who are noticing my pictures, you may have noticed I showed a picture of the ark and asking the question about fossil fuels, right? I'm always asked that question, is there any way that there could have been dinosaurs on the ark? Find out. You're going to have to come back in about 10 minutes. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll reconvene. Thanks for your attention.